Hey folks, Mike Barron here. I want to talk about my latest graphic novel, Sherlock Holmes Meets Captain Nemo, aka Leviathan. I have been a Sherlock Holmes buff ever since I was a wee lad in Madison, Wisconsin. I was a member of the local chapter of the Baker Street Irregulars, whom Holmes fans know is what aficionados call their little groups that would meet once a month, in our case in a stone cottage, to discuss Holmes, our favorite stories, and what we like about him. And what we like about him is that he's an endlessly fascinating character. People ask me, well, how do you grab the reader's attention? And there are a thousand ways, but one of the most important is to create a fascinating character that the readers can't get enough of, and that's Sherlock Holmes. In fact, he's the most widely recognized fictional character in history. And I have been reading Holmes and watching Holmes movies ever since. I started out with A Scandal in Bohemia, which is a short story. And the fascinating thing about A Scandal in Bohemia is about the king of Bohemia who is trying to bury a problem that could destroy his marriage. It's all a misunderstanding, of course. But he first appears to Holmes in disguise because he doesn't want the word to get out that the king of Bohemia is in trouble. And then later in that story, Holmes adopts his first disguise. And this has become a theme throughout the Holmes stories, whether written by Conan Doyle or by somebody post-Conan Doyle. And when they're post-Conan Doyle, we call them Holmes pastiches. And of course, the book I've written, Leviathan, is a Holmes pastiche as well. And I've also taken to watching movies over and over again. My favorite Holmes is Jeremy Brett. And recently I watched his episode of A Scandal in Bohemia. And it had been so long since I read the story that I forgot it. And Holmes is on screen for 15 minutes before I realized that it was Holmes because his disguise was so superb and Jeremy Brett's acting was so excellent. The other stories that stick in mind are The Adventure of the Speckled Band. And if you've read that, you know why. I'm not going to explain the title, but the title is the secret to that story, and it's a mind blower. Other ones that stick in my mind are The Adventure of the Dancing Men, His Last Bow, which is unforgettable. I mean, I remember reading that along with millions of others and saying, no, this cannot be the end of Holmes. And of course it wasn't. Conan Doyle tried to put Holmes to bed with that story. So, because he was sick of the character, but the result, the public result was so overwhelming that he brought him back. And in fact, he brought him back several times, and he ended up writing 57 Holmes stories. And finally, The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is the closest that Conan Doyle ever came to horror. And others have taken that and moved it right into the realm of horror, which I'll explain in a minute, which brings us to the Holmes films. Many people consider Basil Rathbone the ultimate Holmes, and I have to say that he was a superb Holmes, and he's in my top three. He's not my favorite. My favorite is Jeremy Brett, who did a series for the BBC back in the 90s. And for anyone who has ever seen that series, they're struck by how Brett is Holmes. There's no hint that it's an actor whatsoever. You're looking at Sherlock Holmes. And one of the reasons is that Jeremy Brett was a method actor who got into Holmes so completely that he became Holmes, and he had mental problems towards the end of his life because he could not shake that persona. He was Sherlock Holmes to his friends and family. Brett also understood that Holmes had mental problems. And in my opinion, I don't know very much about this, but a lot of people agree with me, he had Asperger's syndrome. And Asperger's syndrome affects your social life in that you're not able to interact with people on an intimate and natural basis, that you have to view life through a prism, and it affects the way you act. And there are high-functioning Asperger's syndrome people and low-functioning, and Holmes was definitely high-functioning, and you can see it when you read his adventures and watch his films, that he does understand that people want empathy and they want him to relate as a normal human being. And he does his best and he's sincere because he doesn't dislike people. He just has a real hard problem relating. So when we get to the films, Jeremy Brett is my favorite because he was so closely Holmes, and that was closely followed by Benedict Cumberbatch, who was another BBC series a couple decades later. And Cumberbatch's Holmes was moved into the 20th century, or the 21st century, excuse me, and that's been tried before, most notably with the TV series Elementary, which I'm watching right now on the recommendation of Paul Bishop, who is a lifelong Holmes fan, is putting together a book of essays on Holmes pastiches, which, as you know, are books that are about Holmes that were not written by Holmes. I contributed one on the Holmes Dracula file by Fred Soberhagen, which is a fascinating novel because it brings Holmes and Dracula together, and his vision of Dracula is 180 degrees from that which is mostly presented in film and literature. It's worth reading, but of course all these pastiches have to get Conan Doyle's style down pat, which was the style of John Watson in relating these stories in the Victorian style. And that means that the language is often fusty, and by that I mean overly elegant to hide unpleasant details. It was the Victorian age. You can't just come right out and say, he shat the bed. You would never say anything like that. You would say something like, oh, my dear, he expressed an extremely unsocial attitude or something like that. And Watson is very delicate in relating these stories, but you understand what he's saying. Now, my third favorite Holmes is Basil Rathbone because he did such an excellent job, and he did so many great Holmes, and a lot of them were brought forward into the 20th century where he was dealing with Nazis, but some were also adapted from the Conan Doyle books, including The Hound of the Baskervilles, which brings me to my favorite Holmes movie, which is The Hound of the Baskervilles, which has been filmed many times. This is not the Basil Rathbone version. This is the Hammer horror universe and starred Peter Cushing as Sherlock Holmes. Peter Cushing is a brilliant Holmes. Christopher Lee plays Lord Baskerville, and of course he's superb. And what's funny about these guys is they switched roles off and on through the years. Christopher Lee often played Holmes, not very well in my opinion, but Holmes is somebody that many actors, especially those raised in the Shakespearean style and in Britain, love to tackle because he's so unforgettable. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes by Billy Wilder, which explored those aspects of his personality that prevented him from becoming a fully normal human being. Now, Leviathan is a pastiche as well, and like other pastiches, it comes from that rich period of Victorian literature where so many unforgettable characters appeared, including Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, H. Rider Haggard's Quatermain, and you may recognize some of the characters that appear in Leviathan. I'm not going to mention them because I want them to be a surprise, and believe me, they will be a surprise when you come to that moment. But the story itself will grab you by the throat on the first page, and it never lets up. And people say, well, how do you do that? I say, well, you create a character that's unforgettable and people are interested in. Well, I did not create Sherlock Holmes, but I'm happy to join the long list of writers who have taken a hand at telling a Sherlock Holmes story. If you like Holmes, you're going to love this story. It's got everything. And as I've said before, Richard Bonk has been waiting his whole life to draw steampunk. He just didn't know it, and he exploded on this book. You're going to gasp at some of the art. Sherlock Holmes and Captain Nemo team up to save the world from a world war. And the enemies they face will seem very strange and yet very familiar. Support the project at baroncomics.com.